So we finally reached the 20th century, and political philosophy was pretty much moribund at the beginning of the 20th century, particularly in the Anglo-American philosophical tradition, probably because of a movement called the logical positivists, who tended to get rid of large swathes of philosophy and regard it as nonsense. If there was any political philosophy, it tended to be utilitarian. And we saw the beginnings of that in Hume and Mill, where utilitarianism is a sort of all-encompassing theory that works for morality and it works for political philosophy as well. It just says that your goal should be to maximize good results, typically understood as happiness, for all affected. So a good society then would be one where people are happiest. And the question of political legitimacy is easy to settle. It's, are you keeping your citizens happy? That's very much oversimplifying. However, that tended to be the discussion. And then, towards the middle of the 20th century, Rawls starts writing until finally he publishes in 1971 one of the great works of political philosophy called A Theory of Justice. And in this, and his work in general, he revitalizes core ideas of the social contract tradition. And Rawls is, in fact, kind of a philosophical magpie. He is enormously well read and picks from each, and very respectful of great thinkers of history, even if they disagree with each other and he disagrees with their conclusions. He sifts through the history of political philosophy and identifies core insights that transcend mistaken theories that might surround them. And a core idea that he thinks is a good corrective to utilitarianism is the social contract tradition. And in particular, the core ideas of the social contract tradition, which we've seen from the earliest one we studied, which was Hobbes, is this basic idea that political inequalities, or inequalities of authority or power, are not natural. That is, naturally, in some sense, humans are both free, in a sense that differs amongst the various philosophers that we've looked at, but they are, in a sense, free from political obligations naturally. So any political obligations that they may come to have are, in some sense, artificial, and they have to have brought them upon themselves. They cannot. You cannot impose. You cannot impose unjustly authority on somebody else. Well, obviously you can. There's a sense in which you can overpower somebody. But if we're going to justify political authority, if we're going to say that people have to, for example, follow the laws of their political system, and they have a duty to do so, then this must be explained in terms that start from a beginning that political authority is not natural. So you reject the political naturalism of Aristotle and Filmer, that in some sense there's a natural hierarchy, some people are more important than others, God wants the kings to rule over the subjects and so on. We reject that idea. And instead, humans are naturally free and equal. Okay. This is an insight that we've seen in Hobbes, we've seen in Locke, we've seen in Rousseau. And even writers who reject the idea of the social contract, for example, we've seen Hume and Mill, think that this is a good insight. But of course, the social contract tradition, from its very inception, had all kinds of criticisms. And these reached the point by the early 20th century that nobody was talking about the social contract anymore. as always, the key one is that social contracts are just a myth. They don't really happen. That, as we saw Hume say in of the original contract, the origin of all societies that exist today is not a group of people getting together and saying, hey, let's form a club. And even if it were, why should their agreement in ancient history have any effect on you? You weren't part of the founding of it. Now, so in Locke, of course, we see the idea that we see two different ways in which you can consent to be part of a political association. One, founding consent. You can be one of the founders. But the one that everybody nowadays undergoes is joining consent. So according to Locke, when you reach the age of reason, you have to make a decision which political system you're going to join. But then, of course, your choice is kind of restricted. You have to join one of the ones that exist because there's no place for you to go except maybe Mars to set up your own. And of course, it's already established, and you're sort of forced to make a choice of the existing ones. So there isn't really a sense in which you're helping to structure your society. That's the most attractive idea of the social contract, the image of these people constructing their own political system to meet their needs. And the other, so as a result, the social contract paints this kind of artificial picture, critics like Hume pointed out, of humans in their natural state. I mean, we see this most vividly in Rousseau's Discourse, where he literally describes humans, sort of ancient humans wandering about in the forests. What's that got to do with modern humans, critics would say? Modern humans exist in a situation where the earth is covered with political systems, and they're not going to really get the chance to build their own. Rawls takes on board a lot of the criticisms of the social contract tradition. So he doesn't present the social contract as in any way historical. And he doesn't even present it, as Locke does, as part of a consent theory of political obligation. According to Locke, you are only obliged to follow the laws of a country that you have agreed to become part of. As Hume pointed out, you don't really have a choice, particularly if you're poor. You know, poor people have about as much choice to be part of the country that they're part of as sailors who have been press-ganged onto a ship have a choice about being there. You know, what's the alternative? They jump into the sea and drown. So they don't. It's kind of false to say that they really have a choice. So that's why Hume suggests an alternative is, you know, let's not talk about their political societies in some sense being their choice. Let's just focus on whether or not it meets their needs. Let's try and focus on whether or not it maximizes happiness, as later utilitarians would say. All right. So in what sense is John Rawls's theory a social contract theory? Well, it's not a social contract theory where the contract is undergone by actual individuals in their actual circumstances. So even though Rawls is very insistent that we ourselves come into the world already socially embedded, as it were, you're born into a culture. It gives you your language, it gives you your values. You are, and this is a point that a lot of the social contract theorists, but probably Rousseau the most, stress, you are shaped by the culture and society into which you're born. But at the same time, the culture is a human product. The language is a human product. The institutions that are part of what Rawls calls the basic structure of your society, the schools, the constitution, the the legal institutions, all of the things that form the background of that affect your rights, your duties, and what stuff you get that is a byproduct of the advantages of us living in society. Those institutions, they shape you, but you also shape them in a way that should be in your power. And this is a sort of insight that we can see in Marx. For example, Marx says under capitalism, the problem is that we are alienated from the things that we produce, which include our cultures. Like for example, we experience market forces as if they were totally beyond our control, when really the market is a human product. And one of the goals of communism is to achieve so that you're no longer alienated, so that we as a group are in full control of those kind of things. This idea we also find in Rawls. Here is the question that he asks. The other thing is about the social contract tradition, is the social contracts are explaining or being used to justify or to answer different questions. Well, typically the question that a social contract is being used to answer is, why should I obey the laws? Not because the king is appointed by God. That's what social contract theorists reject. So if the king is not appointed by God, why should I do what he says? And the social contract is intended to be the answer. That is, you can have justified systems of authority, even if naturally you are not under political authority. You're naturally free and equal. What Rawls uses the social contract to explain, or to at least sort of ground, is a theory of justice. Now, justice is used in a lot of senses in philosophy and language. There's the justice system. Whether or not you go to jail, what counts as a crime, what counts as a felony, those kind of things. That's one sense of justice. There's also the sense of distributive justice. Who should get what in society? Typically, we see this topic when people talk about things being unjust. So it's more discussed in the negative. People will point to something like apartheid, or they will point to vast inequalities that we see in contemporary Western societies, and the US most of all, and they say that's unjust. So what would be just? What would be, so in this sense, justice is the property of a well-ordered society, a society that's set up in the right way. And this sense of justice dates all the way back to the ancient Greeks. For example, Plato's Republic is a discussion of justice in a city-state. And he's tackling exactly this question. What would be a well-constructed city-state where everything is done right? That's the issue that Rawls thinks the social contract can help us address. Because he believes, like the social contract theorists do, that we are free and we are equal in some deep sense, and that society should be fair. Okay, so he calls his theory of justice, the name that he gives to it is justice as fairness. And he uses this name many times throughout his career. There's an early article that predates theory of justice that has sort of an embryonic version of his social contract theory that's called Justice as Fairness. I've got a video on that article. He's one of the last things that was published. I don't know if he was even published when he was alive. It might have been just after he was alive. It's called Justice as Fairness, a Briefer Restatement. That's now the book that people read so that they don't have to read a theory of justice, even though actually it's a lot harder to read because it's so condensed. And then there's an article he published in the 90s called Justice as Fairness, Political, Not Metaphysical. So he uses this phrase all the time, but basically it refers to his conception of justice. So a conception of justice is an idea of principles that will, if applied to the basic structure of society, will make it just. So justice as fairness is a conception of justice. Now, it's not the only conception of justice. There are many competing conceptions of justice. He thinks it's the right one. So you can go into the content of his theory. And that's actually what Daniel Chandler, in the book I've asked you to read, Free and Equal, is most interested in doing. Looking at what it would be like, what his conception means, and what a society organized by his conception would be like, and why this would be a better one than the one we have. But there's also the sort of procedural question. How do we know that these are right? I mean, you can just look at them and say, sounds right to me. Sounds like, hey, I imagine a society organized this way. Sounds like a pretty good society. But that's not going to convince many people who are sort of knee-jerk opposed to some of the proposals that he's giving here. Now, quickly, justice as fairness is, when you boil it down to its bare essentials, it consists of, he says, two principles. One of them that represents freedom, and one of them which represents equality. And here's a very important fact about them. They are lexically ordered. So what that means is that this one is more important than this one, and this one is more important than this one. Slightly confusingly, even though he says that there are two principles, the second one is broken into two parts, and one of the parts is itself called a principle. So this is supposed to be a principle that also contains within it a principle that is different from this one, which you can call the fair equality of opportunity principle. So it's a little confusing. But if you hear justice as fairness is the two principles that are lexically ordered, one is more important than the other. And they represent a commitment to freedom and equality. And here are the two principles. Number one, each person has the same indefeasible claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, which scheme is compatible with the same scheme for all. Okay, and as Chandler points out, the liberties, so here's an interesting and important point. Throughout the social contract theorists we've been looking at, each of them has their own conception of what freedom is. Is it merely not being interfered with by others? That is basically the Hobbesian idea. Rousseau has three kinds of freedom. The natural freedom sounds a lot like the Hobbesian one, just being left alone, not being messed with. But then there's also civil freedom, which is, you can think of as like natural freedom, but the largest sort of circle of non-interference that you can have, given that you're embedded in a society where everybody else wants the same. But then there's finally moral freedom, which is a sort of autonomy that you get from being part of the general will and by legislating, by making laws for the society as a whole. That in itself is sort of a moral power, and he calls that moral freedom. So there are all these different conceptions of what freedom is. Rawls, instead of talking about freedom, singular, talks about liberties, plural, and allows that there are a wide range of them. And these sound a lot like rights. So liberties are basically rights. And so they are things that protect interests that are very basic. And as Chandler says, they come in three basic categories. There's the personal liberties, which include things like freedom of speech. There's the political freedoms, which include being able to vote. And then there's the procedural freedoms, which include things like being, you have a right to a fair trial, things like that. So these things have to be protected, and you cannot sacrifice any of these for any amount of gain in the second kind of thing, which is the equality. Okay, so the second principle is social and economic inequalities are permissible only if they satisfy two conditions. So, first thing to note is that inequalities are permissible. Rawls is an egalitarian, but his system allows that some inequalities, having some inequalities of the right kind, will result in a better organized, more just society than pure equality, where everybody is treated exactly the same, or where we rigidly enforce nobody having more than anybody else. Okay, but basically the default is that if you're veering away from inequality, you have to justify it in the right way. So equality is sort of the default position. Why? Because humans are equal and they should be treated as such and valued equally. So if in some sense they're ending up in unequal circumstances, it must be for a reason that serves the greater justice. Okay, so when are they permissible? First, if they are attached to positions and offices open to everyone under fair equality of opportunity. So, for example, one of the main criticisms by capitalists of, for example, the so-called communism of the Eastern Bloc prior to 1989 was that it got rid of incentives. In treating everybody equally, there's no incentive to do better, and consequently, people don't work hard, people don't care enough, and the great engine of capitalism, which is people working for themselves, producing a larger pie that lifts everybody else up, is lost. And Rawls says, that might be true. He doesn't say it is true, but he says that might be true. It might be true that paying doctors more than garbage collectors is good for society as a whole because it provides an incentive for people to become doctors, and otherwise there's really much less incentive to become a doctor because it requires a whole hell of a lot of learning and hard work that maybe garbage collector doesn't. So yes, of course, someone like a Marxist would say, but look, we want the people who want to be doctors, who are intrinsically interested in doctoring, to become doctors and to do it because they love it, not because they're going to be paid. But there's a chance where if we left it up to that, there wouldn't be enough doctors and everybody would suffer. So, given that it's possible that the capitalists are right about incentives, then it is justified to pay certain positions more, provided anyone has the same equality of opportunity to get that job. Now, critics of this might immediately bristle and say, you mean we've got to let somebody who is underqualified fly a plane because otherwise they aren't getting a fair equality of opportunity? No, that's not what he means by fair equality of opportunity. So we have to get into the details. But it has to be the case that institutionally there are not barriers so that somebody who could be a doctor, if they're born the wrong race, sex, or in a ghetto or whatever, will never get a chance to get there. We have to fix that problem, with the setup of our institutions, which are ordered by these principles. And that's how we achieve fair equality of opportunity. We don't sort of allow people to be handicapped by crappy schools and then say, oh, well, because you went to a crappy school, we're going to let you in with low scores. That's not a way to fix the problem. That's the problem already affecting their chances. Instead, we make sure that everybody has access to good schools. That's the way to achieve fair equality of opportunity. That's the first kind of inequality that can be justified. You can pay certain professions more than others. And secondly, and this is the difference principle on which maybe the most ink on Rawls has been spilled, and that is that the inequalities are to achieve the greatest. Let me just read what it says. They are to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Now, this sounds paradoxical. If you have inequalities, somebody's high, somebody's low. How can that inequality be to the benefit of the low one? Clearly, it seems to be to the benefit of the high one. So how can the fact that there's a distance between the highest and the lowest be structured so that it's to the benefit of the lowest? That doesn't make sense. Well, it does, because what he has in mind is this. Imagine if you're choosing between three societies. Say in one, the people on the top are fantastically wealthy. Your Elon Musks, your Jeff Bezoses, your Bill Gates, and so on. And then the people on the bottom are, basically dying in the gutter. Now, the United States as a whole is the wealthiest society in the world. Is that a society that meets these criteria? Well, it depends what the alternatives are. Suppose there's an alternative which is where every rigidly enforced equality. There's no distance between the highest and the lowest. But like under Soviet communism, this means that it's not a very productive society. Yes, nobody's starving in the gutter, but nobody's doing particularly well either. So the highest and the lowest are both at plus 100 instead of plus 1,000. What is this measure? I don't know. Come up with some kind of measure of well-being. This one is to be preferred to this one. Why? Because the least well-off are better under this. So in other words, your choice, the factor that determines which society you grade highest, according to this second principle, is you look at the situation of the least well-off. Here, the least well-off is better than here. So this one is preferable. But notice, even though there's inequality here, the least well-off is better off than here. So we allow, according to Rawls, this inequality, the distance between the highest and the lowest, is permissible because it benefits the person on the bottom. Because if we got rid of it, the person on the bottom would be exactly the same as the person on the top, but would be worse off than if we allow this gap. This principle is called maximin. That is, your job is to maximize the position, the minimum position. You maximize the minimum, the least well off. All right, so that was an incredibly brief and sketchy description of Rawls's conception of justice, these two principles of justice. Why should anybody buy this? How is he going to convince anybody that this is the right system? And that's where his version of the social contract comes in, and his idea of the original position. Imagine you're in charge of deciding on a conception of justice. What would be the right way to go about it? Well, once again, you can look to the history of the social contract that we've done in this class for some pros and cons. And in particular, let's think of Rousseau's critique of Locke's social contract idea. So Locke says, if you remember, that people in the state of nature can amass wealth. Now, he does restrict property by saying you've got to leave enough and as good, and you can't take so much of like spoilable goods that you hoard them and they go off and they're wasted. No spoilage, and you have to leave enough and as good for each other. But then he gives you a huge loophole in money. And he says money doesn't spoil, and basically there's an inexhaustible amount of money. So I can amass great stores of money in the state of nature. But then I have something to lose, and then I realize, it would be nice if there's a political system that enforced that protected my property rights on the stuff that I've worked so hard to amass. Every bourgeoisie can appreciate the quandary that Locke is in. So then all of these people recognize that they have an interest in founding a system that protects their rights, notably to life, liberty, and property. And that's how you get a Lockean state, which is fairly minimal. It's just enough to protect property rights, and we don't want it taking away any of the property, because what was the point of founding it in the first place? To protect my property. So it shouldn't be the case that the state comes and takes away my property. So obviously this is very appealing to libertarians. Libertarians say that's what a state should be like. The bare minimum that will just protect property rights and won't try and make anybody better off. Won't try and take money from the entrepreneurs and give it to the moochers and leeches underneath. Rousseau presents this as a trick by the rich. And as he says, look what's going on. Locke is saying you can acquire all this stuff. And why can you acquire all this stuff? Why are you justified in saying that this stuff, this money is mine? Because of the law of nature. And Rousseau says, funny, everybody says there's a law of nature and nobody can agree on what it is. So I'm a little suspicious that there really is a law of nature. So if you take away the law of nature, basically people just amass a bunch of stuff, sort of hoard it and say, okay, it's mine, and to prove it's mine, we're going to set up a system that says it's mine, that has laws that say it's mine. So they basically get stuff that isn't theirs, that they don't have a right to because there's no such thing as rights in the state of nature, and then they construct a system that magically does make it theirs by right. And obviously this is in the interests of the rich people who have the property. They're the ones who benefit from a system that protects property rights. The people who have nothing don't benefit at all. In fact, they lose out because now they can't take the stuff because there are laws against it. So one lesson you can take from this is that we have to be very careful in deciding our conception of justice, the principles that are supposed to organize the basic structure of our society. We don't want it to be the case that in choosing our conception of justice, we are trying to further our own interests. That's what was wrong with the Lockean system, according to Rousseau, that it's a system rigged to favor property owners to the expense of everybody else. That isn't fair. And what Rawls says is, I want a conception of justice that is as fair as possible. How do we ensure that this happens, that the choosers, the people that so let's appoint people to choose our conception of justice. You could say to draft our conception of justice, to come up with it from scratch, but there are problems with that I'll get into in a second. But suppose we want people to choose. Well, what can we do to ensure that those people won't, even subconsciously, rig the system in their favor? And here's how you do it, the original position. Basically, it's very similar to the idea of, suppose you have a birthday cake, and there are 6 kids, and you want it to be divided equally. How are you going to ensure that? And one of the kids gets to cut it. Here's how you ensure it. The one who cuts the cake gets the last slice. So they're going to try and ensure that the slices are as equal as possible so that the last slice is as big as possible. Obviously, they can't rig it so they get the biggest slice, because if they cut it so that one slice is big, the first kid to take a slice is going to take that one. But they're going to get the last one that's left. So they're going to ensure that the last one that's left will be the biggest one. They're employing maximin as their reasoning. And this is a way to ensure that the cake is cut fairly. Now, how do we do that kind of thing when choosing conceptions of justice? Well, this is the idea of the original position, and this is where it ties into a social contract theory. So instead of the parties to the social contract sort of bargaining together, getting together in the state of nature and bargaining, we imagine parties to the social contract being in an artificial situation called the original position. This is instead of the state of nature, because there is no state of nature in modern societies. Rawls agrees that the state of nature is artificial. If it ever, Hume is right, if it ever existed, it doesn't have anything to do with today, where there are existing cultures and societies. So instead, the original position is, as Rawls puts it, it's not a real place. It's a thought experiment. You can put yourself in the original position by imagination. But what the important part is, he says, look, listen to the way I'm describing this. Don't you agree that this is the fair way to choose it? And he thinks that even people who are inclined to disagree with his views will agree that if we are to choose fairly, it should be from the original position. So that's why it's a very useful tool. It's a way to win over everybody, because after all, and what Rawls is he's kind of a pragmatic optimist. He's pragmatic in that he recognizes the real world. And this is perhaps most obvious in his second major work. He basically wrote 3 books in his lifetime. The most famous and most influential is the 1971 work, Theory of Justice. But he also put out a book in the 90s called Political Liberalism, which he claims is entirely consistent with theory of justice, but a lot of people saw as a sort of a departure. There are a lot of people who are fans of theory of justice who are not happy with political liberalism. But he sees it as entirely consistent. And in that work in particular, he says, look, let's focus on the kind of society I'm talking about. And here, a good analogy is Marx thinks that you can only have communism at a certain stage in history, where you've reached abundance, where you've reached, capitalism has produced institutions within it that are compatible with communism, and there's mechanization and so on. Well, Rawls is saying my conception of justice is not like the conception of justice that applies at any stage in history. It's not a conception of justice that you would institute in Athens in Aristotle's time. Instead, I want a conception of justice for the society that I care about, which is essentially very much like the United States. It is a society characterized by the fact of pluralism, of comprehensive conceptions of the good. Okay, that is, Rawls does not believe, as some ancient philosophers would believe, that there is only one right way to live, like Aristotle or Plato. He doesn't believe that there's only one right way to live. Now, that doesn't mean that he himself doesn't have a view about the right way to live his life. He does. And, for example, he was religious to begin with, but his experiences in World War II made him lose his religion. So he was largely secular, at least in his philosophical life. He was actually, before he was in World War II, he thought about becoming a priest. But so certainly, you know, he doesn't have one of the great world religions as an organizing principle in his life. Does that mean that that he will design his society as secular? No, because he believes that there are many equally justifiable ways to live. And these can include religious ways to live. These can include utilitarianism, of which he was the major critic in the 20th century and offered the major alternative. But nonetheless, he saw that utilitarians had some powerful arguments, and that fellow philosophers who remained utilitarians despite reading his work weren't misguided. They had good reasons. They weren't his reasons, but they had good reasons. So he thinks that because of this fact, there are limits to to convincing people that you're right and they're wrong. And you will always have, this is an enduring fact about diverse societies, which are the ones that the modern world is full of. And actually, so in this respect, this makes him very different from someone like Rousseau, because if you read The Social Contract, he describes in great detail all of these features about the general will and so on. And then in rather a pathetic sort of coda, he reveals that it would only work in very narrow, restricted circumstances, and basically the only place he can think of where his system would work is Corsica, which is an island off the French coast. Well, then what's the point, you kind of think? And part of the problem is that in order to foster the general will, you need a monoculture with a civic religion, with a single civic religion. And that's just not modern societies, even in Rousseau's time, and it's certainly not true of ours. So Rawls's conception of justice orders the basic structure of a society characterized by the fact of pluralism of comprehensive conceptions of good. Comprehensive means not just in your political life, but in your private life. The word political, when Rawls uses it, is in contrast with comprehensive. So kind of paralleling the distinction in Hegel and the early Marx between the state and civil society, the political world is the way in which the basic structure is organized. Now, the basic structure can contain within it institutions that are not, the internal structures of which are not part of the basic structure. What do I mean? Well, think of the family. The family is a very important institution in any society. It's where we get our education, it's where we are brought, it shapes us perhaps more than any other institution. And acknowledging this, Plato, most famously in the Republic, thinks that it's too dangerous to allow the family to be in private hands, as it were. So he takes child rearing away from the parents and makes sure that it is done communally, and furthermore, that parents don't even know whose child is theirs. The idea being that then everybody in their city is as if they're their child and they will care equally about them. Rawls is appalled by this, as is everybody who reads the Republic. Nobody thinks that that's a good idea. So Rawls acknowledges that the family, it's very important that the family be part of the private sphere, not governed, so sort of sealed off from his conception of justice. His conception of justice is not to be instituted on a family level. You're not supposed to apply his principles as to who sits where at the dinner table or who does what chores. No. The family is up to the family. Now, critics on the left of Rawls, or egalitarian critics of Rawls, say that this is a dangerous concession because that's when dogmatic views like the inequality of men and women, and kind of views about religion that affect other people adversely, like that homosexuality is immoral and so on. That's where those ideas, that's the pressure cooker that produces those ideas, and it's going to be destabilizing. But Rawls says, no, it's too important. That is, some of the equal basic liberties that this is supposed to protect are parental rights to raise your children the way you want. Now, having said that, we've also got to respect the rights of the children, and for example, Rawls would not allow such things as, for example, have happened, like Christian scientists refusing blood transfusions for their kids and the kids dying. That kind of thing is not respecting the equal basic liberties of the children. But so you can have liberties on the same level that face off against each other, and it can be the case that parental rights cannot trump the rights of the children, but they certainly are prioritized over dealing with inequalities. So, for example, critics of Rawls would say, if you allow private child rearing, it will foster inequality. And he says, well, too bad, because the parental rights are too important. So the family is an institution that is in some sense part of the basic structure, but it's not part in the sense that its internal workings are not the subject of the principles of justice. It's part of the basic structure in the sense that its relationship to other institutions, the way those institutions are related, that is organized, that's structural, and that's the kind of thing that the principles of justice are supposed to apply to. Another problem with Rawls is that it all can seem very abstract and high level. One of the things, Rawls is almost as bad as Marx for proliferating capitalized terms. The difference principle, the original position, the veil of ignorance, the fact of pluralism, overlapping consensus, justice as fairness. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a million of them. And the number of examples to be found, actually, Rawls is worse than Marx for the number of examples. There's very few examples in Rawls because it's all very high level, and that's for a good reason. Rawls doesn't want to scare off. Well, he thinks that actually the number of different ways of living compatible with his system are going to be fairly broad. So he's not going to say, here's what my theory says about, should the shops be open on Sunday. Anything specific like that is not going to be directly affected by this. whether or not there should be religious holidays, or the extent to which one religion can't be favored by another, yes, but over another in a well-organized society, yes, that's going to follow, but the nitty-gritty is something he stays out of. Okay, so political liberalism is, it's liberalism because of the liberal tradition which it embodies. That is, that we treat people free and equally, and that they have liberties. That's where liberalism comes from, the idea of being free and equal. Locke is a liberal in that sense, but so is Rousseau. Hobbes is, even though they're all very different. They have this core idea that, that humans are individually valuable in a way that cannot be sacrificed for the common good. So the liberal tradition is opposed to the idea that humans are like ants, where some should be sacrificed to form a bridge to save the more important ones. That's an illiberal conception of humanity. Now, but it's political liberalism in the sense that it is above the fray. It's not a liberalism that tells you how you should live your everyday life. It's supposed to provide rules that allow you to have a non-liberal view of how to live your life alongside another different group of people who have a different view of how to live your life. So Muslims, Christians, Jews are all part of this society, and should their cultures should survive and flourish alongside others. So it's very much like the American ideal, as used to be, that we're all this, people from all walks of life can live their different lives and be all part of this society and all equally committed to it, despite coming from different backgrounds, and all regard themselves as equally valued and regard the system as fair. Political liberalism is not like there is such a thing as liberal as a comprehensive conception of the good. And that, you might say, sounds a lot more like Mill. For example, Mill would say you have to exercise your autonomy. You have to, you can never sort of be reliant on other people. You might say that's a Rousseauian idea. These kind of ideas that tell you how you should live your everyday life. Like, for example, you couldn't be part of, what's this movement that you see a lot on TikTok? Trad wives. Rawls would say it's okay to be a trad wife, so long as you are aware that you don't have to be one, that you have equal rights, that you are not, that actually your society regards you as equally valuable as the husband to whom you are subservient. You should be aware of that, but in your everyday life, it's okay to live that life, to take orders from your husband, to just stay home and have a zillion kids. That's okay, so long as that's your view of the good. Okay. Now, and it must be the case, this is ideas in political liberalism, that that we do all affirm the conception of justice, and we're going to affirm it for different reasons. And what he says, an ideally stable society like this, organized like this, is going to be one that forms an overlapping consensus, where my reasons for regarding this conception of justice as the right one will draw from my comprehensive conception of the good, and your reasons will draw from your comprehensive conception, and we might have different reasons, but they overlap in these core principles. And something that allows this to happen is the existence of a public political culture. Again, much like we find in the United States. And actually, over the last 10 years or so, the public political culture has been somewhat eroded. But still, you get this idea that, for example, a key idea of the public political culture, when Rawls was writing in the 50s, that doesn't need justifying. It's sort of a rock bottom value. Is slavery as bad? There are some corners of the internet that would make Rawls roll over in his grave. But still, there are ideas like that that provide the basis for the way we construct the original position. So let's go back to the original position. The original position is a thought experiment, and we imagine people in there. And what this thought experiment is supposed to model is, in other words, it's like we're designing a computer program to pick conceptions of justice. What do we give it as directives, or what shapes its decision procedure? And he says, the original position is a device of representation that models the conception of society as a system of cooperation on fair terms. This is a fancy way of saying we set up the original position so that whatever system it chooses will be a fair one, just like the example of the cake. In designing it so that the person who cuts the cake... Now, the other feature, actually, notice if the person who cut the cake didn't care how much he or she got, then that wouldn't ensure fairness. So another key feature of the cake cutting procedure that ensures that it ends up with fair is that the person cutting the cake wants the best for themselves. They are self-interested. And that is true of the parties of the original position. So they are self-interested. Now, this got a lot of criticism. Rawls got criticized for this. And it was criticized, saying that he was promoting a view of human nature, that humans are self-interested. And it's a key misunderstanding of Rawls, because the parties in the original position aren't meant to be us. They're just choosers that will choose the theory of justice that meets the criteria that we want for it. So in making them self-interested, it's like getting the greediest kid to cut the cake that they get the last slice of. That doesn't mean all kids are greedy. It just means that that is a way to get the fair result that we want. Okay, so the parties in the original position are not meant to model what humans are like. They're meant to model our conception of society as a system of cooperation on fair terms for mutual benefit. I mean, one of the things Rawls keeps coming back to, particularly when he is criticized constantly, is, look, what's your idea? Why is society important? We can't opt out of society in the world as it is. I mean, okay, occupy Mars. Yeah, okay, Mr. Billionaire, you go ahead and do that and terraform it. For the rest of us mortals, we can't opt out. We have to. And it's a good thing that we're part of society, because society produces the goods of cooperation. What are the goods of cooperation? You know, institutions, public transport, education, exchange, you know, the things that capitalists like, exchanging one thing for another. Society produces this amazing byproduct of cooperation. But it should be that the rewards of society are fair. It shouldn't be that, as Marx said, it shouldn't be the case that one group of people is giving all the benefits to the others. That's clearly what's going on here. That's not fair. We're modeling this idea that society should be a system of cooperation on fair terms for mutual benefit, right? We can all agree. So he's saying to everybody, okay, is everybody on board with the project? If you're not on board with the project of deciding on principles that are to regulate the basic structure, to organize the basic structure of a society, then okay, go away. But the rest of you kind of makes sense, right? You agree. we're naturally free, right? And that we can't have a system of slaves. So you agree with that, don't you? Okay, then you want a system, you want the people, or the mechanism. Think of the parties in the original position as kind of like a mechanism of choice. We're going to, instead of all of us who have all our baggage, trying to agree amongst ourselves on principles, that's never going to happen. But we can all agree on appointing somebody to do it. Who would we trust to pick the system? Given that we've got to have one, because it's not the case that there isn't a conception of justice organizing our society. It's just an incredibly ramshackle, inconsistent one. And it leads to all kinds of problems. And we all agree this is suboptimal. So how would we improve it? We'd come up with a better system that reflected the values that we share. Okay, so what are the values that we share? They're going to be very high-level ones because we disagree on so much. But we agree that society should be a system of cooperation. Shouldn't be one side enslaving another. That wouldn't be cooperation. No, it's cooperation. Why? And it has to be cooperation. Why? Because the particles, the atoms that make it up, the individuals, are free and equal. Now, one of the innovations of Rawls is that he spells out that as citizens, this is in our political role, not necessarily in our home life, but as citizens that are participate in political life, we are free and equal, and we have two moral powers. The two moral powers are a capacity for a sense of justice. I've got these the wrong way round. Sorry. This is the rational one, and this is the reasonable one. So this goes up here, and this goes down here. The capacity for a sense of justice. That is, we have the ability to recognize when cooperation is appropriate and just. That is, we have if we were just complete freeloaders and we were if we were all psychopaths, psychopaths are just not supposed to recognize other people as sources of valid claims, right? So as far as a psychopath goes, I don't need to tell you the truth. The point of my words is just to get you to do what I want. So I'll just say anything, so long as it will get you to do what I want. So they're great manipulators. They don't think that I have an obligation to tell you the truth, because they don't recognize obligations from other people. So they would lack a sense of justice. A sense of justice is, you have a sense of justice if you recognize other people as sources of valid claims, that they should be respected as valuable in the same way that you are, and that therefore you must cooperate with them on terms that meet your standards. Clearly, if they're trying to enslave you, they say our concept of justice is that you do all the work and we do all the sitting around. Well, that's not fair. But so you could still have this capacity for a sense of justice and rebel, and it's because of your sense of justice. You say, my sense of justice says that you're not abiding by these. But if everybody has a sense of justice, then it's at least possible that we can collaborate, and that we can, I can make concessions and you can make concessions, and we can make it work. Without the sense of justice, it's never going to work. So we want to make it work, so this makes sense, right? And if you have a sense of justice, you are in his sense reasonable. And this is his own special term, but it mirrors the way we use reasonable. Like if somebody says, no, I'm not going to do that unless I get everything, we say, you're being unreasonable. What is it to be reasonable? It's to give and take. So the moral powers of the citizens are that they have a sense of justice, but there has to be a reason why you want to cooperate, and that's the second one. That's the capacity to form, revise, and pursue a conception of the good. But we don't want to spell out what your conception of the good. We don't want to spell out that, you should maximize your autonomy or that you should maximize your service to Allah or whatever. We're just going to say you have a conception of the good and you have an interest in forming and revising and pursuing it. Now, of course, fundamentalist religions are not going to like this part, but part of Rawls's liberalism is that you can change your mind about your values. That's an important feature of being a human being, according to liberals, that you are more important than a particular ideology, that it's you that we care about, and not that you are a vessel for an ideology and you can never change your mind. So that's what he means here. You have a capacity to form, revise, and pursue your conception of the good. That's what you have as a citizen. And so the parties in the original position is supposed to model this, and the way it does, in the same way that the cake cutting exercise models fairness by the artificial mechanism of having the person choose last and being self-interested, the original position is set up to choose the system of justice that best achieves these things that we all value by the parties being self-interested and choosing behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. All right, the veil of ignorance is this idea that there's certain things you don't know. So think of yourself, you're a party in the original position. Your job is to choose a theory of justice. Now, you're not going to have, you are actually, because you're behind the veil of ignorance, you don't have, the reason why you're behind a veil of ignorance, that such that you don't know who you're going to be. Think of the Pixar movie, Soul. I hope you've seen that. In that movie, you have this idea of these little blue blobs existing before they get their life on Earth. So it's as if they're disembodied souls. Now, they don't know who they're going to be. They're just souls. The parties in the original position, you can think of them as like that. So imagine you gave the job of designing the society that the person they're going to become lives in. Imagine you gave that job to the blobs. The great thing about the blobs designing it is they can't rig it in their favor. Why can't they rig it in their favor? Because they don't know who they're going to be. They don't know if they're going to be male. They don't know what race they're going to be. They don't know what sexual orientation they're going to be. They don't know if they're going to be disabled. They don't know how smart they're going to be. So they're not going to rig it in the way that, according to Rousseau, the rich rigged Locke's society. So the veil of ignorance is a way to achieve fairness. It's in just the same way as the cake cutting example. It means that you can't end up with a society that is rigged in the favor of anybody because you don't know what you're going to be. Okay, you might say, well then, what are your criteria for judging one better than another? If you're not allowed to rig it in your own favor, how are you going to even rank them? And the answer is, you're going to rank them according to Maximin, because you are going to ensure that whoever you turn out to be, it's going to be the best possible situation. So you're going to care about the worst off in society because that might be you. You're not, now you might say, well, why don't you gamble? Why don't you gamble on a society like this? Because you could be Elon Musk. Because this is your life. Nobody gambles with their life. Like the example that Chandler gives is, imagine if you're choosing routes and you want to get there as fast as possible. You might just toss a coin. You might gamble on the riskier route that, if it works, gets you there quicker. But if you're if you're going to the hospital and you're bleeding out, you're not going to gamble on the one that could get there faster but also could be jammed for good. You're going to be the one that is not necessarily the fastest but is the most reliable, because you're not going to risk dying just to get there faster. Same kind of idea here. Because it's your entire life, you're not going to gamble on that one. You're going to pick, you're going to use maximin. Well, what are you maximizing? You don't know what you want. You don't know if you like money. You might be a monk in a society. What do you care about money? Well, what you're evaluating these by is primary goods. So these numbers represent primary goods. And primary goods, in theory of justice, he kind of tinkered with this later on. They're basically things that anybody would want. These include, of course, kind of abstract things like basic liberties. But the main thing that they include is income and wealth, because these are already cemented. You're going to get these. But on top of these, income and wealth, economic power and control, and opportunities for self-respect. That is, or the social bases of self-respect. It has to be the case that you're designing a society where you can feel good about yourself taking a particular role. So, for example, a society where wheelchairs were provided for the disabled, but the disabled had to admit that they were worthless pieces of shit to get these wheelchairs, is not one where they can feel self-respect. They're getting wheelchairs, they're getting mobility, but it's still unjust because nobody should feel that badly about themselves. So this idea, I think, is influenced by Rousseau's discussion of amour propre. Amour propre, of course, is this idea that of viewing yourself through the eyes of others, and everybody wants respect. This was seen as a negative thing in the discourse on the origin of inequality. It led to people fighting. But in social contract, Rousseau says that there's a positive sense of it, and if you get the right respect, then your sense of self is lifted. Okay, so these are the kind of things that, whatever your comprehensive conception of the good, whatever you end up valuing, whatever you end up being like, your race, gender, sexual orientation, these will be good for you. So that's what we're going to try and maximize. These ideas, so you can ask Rawls, well, where do you get these ideas from? He said, well, you agree with them, right? And why do you agree with them? Because you have the same public political culture as he does. These are ideas that everybody in society can get behind and do get behind. This is like, the kind of things that are, in this country, American values, or in every Western country, like in France, they'd be liberty, equality, fraternité. These are all values that are supposed to be political, that we all share as being part of a political system. Public political culture enables public reason in order to justify policies when you're in the nitty-gritty of making laws. So these are not actual, these are at the level of generality that they're above the Constitution. If anything, this is what you should bear in mind in structuring your Constitution. So this is more general than the Constitution, but the Constitution should be organized with this in mind. And then the further you go down to like city ordinances, the less directly these apply, until, of course, when you get into rules within the family, they don't apply at all. But when you're discussing what laws should be in effect in, say, Congress or something like that, whatever parliamentary system you end up with, you have to use public reasons, which are divorced from comprehensive conceptions of the good. So, for example, you can't say abortion should be illegal because my God is opposed to it, because in my religion it's murder. You can't use that reason. You have to use reasons that can be accepted by all. Again, this is something that we've seen a huge amount of erosion in this country from Rawls's time. Rawls would never have imagined people seriously claiming that the earth is flat, or that vaccines are wrong, or that you're a cuck if you get vaccinated, or that you shouldn't wear masks. I mean, that would never have occurred to him. I think he would be deeply depressed that we've lost this public resource. I mean, he knew that we disagreed with each other, but he thought that there was common grounds in science, for example, and that there were things that were above the fray. But somehow those have been dragged down into the party political fray, which is very much not political as he understands it, which is neutral. So you have a duty of civility in reasoning in the public sphere to use reasons that everybody can accept. Now, he says you can supplement them with reasons from your own comprehensive conception of the good. And the example that Chandler gives is Martin Luther King argues for civil rights policies both because they're consistent with the Constitution, but also because of Christianity. He appeals to Christianity as well as, so you can supplement your arguments that are constitutional, that are drawn from the public political culture, with ideas from your comprehensive conception of the good. So we haven't even discussed in much detail exactly what these entail. That's what Chandler gets into in great detail in his book. But certainly fair equality of opportunity is to be distinguished from formal equality of opportunity. That is, if anybody claims, hey, we have fair equality of opportunity because you're not allowed to use race in hiring. You're not allowed to use sex in hiring. Well, clearly this is not working because we have a persistent wage gap between men and women and a persistent poverty according to race, not just according to economic class. So genuinely fair equality of opportunity requires great upheaval, huge investment in education, making sure that everybody, no matter how, for example, you don't fund public education on a tax according to the local tax base, because then the schools in poor neighborhoods are poor and shitty because the money to pay for them is coming from poor people. Whereas the public schools, and there are such things, in Beverly Hills are fantastic. It should be the case that the public schools in Compton are the same, are just as good as the public schools in Beverly Hills. And that, of course, would require a great upheaval. That'll do it for a lightning overview that barely scratches the surface, because this was Rawls's life's work, and he put a lot of work into it.